Okay, so this is my review of episode 3 of The Undoing, Do No Harm. Like the whole series is, it is directed by Suzanne Bier and written by David E. Kelley. Like every review for this show, no book spoilers. I will delete your comment immediately if you mention anything from the book that is to be discussed somewhere else, but not here. In these reviews, we're acting like the book doesn't exist. I haven't read the book myself, so I'm making theories based on just first watch of this show. Okay, so last episode we ended where Grace actually calls the police on her husband, Jonathan, and she is kind of on a war path to get her revenge on Jonathan by having him take the brunt of the blame for this murder, and she's still furious about learning about the affair. This episode also confirms that that is Jonathan's kid that Elena had, and this episode also sets up and lets us see all the evidence against Jonathan here that the public sees, the police sees, the court sees. And what really hurt him as a character was being that he found Elena and he was there that night, but he ran away and didn't report it to the police, which always makes you hugely suspicious. But in this story now progressing with Jonathan being painted as the number one suspect, they introduce this character of Badger, played by Douglas Hodge, who I love as a character actor. I actually interviewed him. You can check that out on my channel when he did the episode of Black Mirror, Black Museum. But his character is important in this story because to me, he plays the position of the audience, and because he's saying he's a master at reading people. And in this episode, he gets a read on Jonathan and he gets a read on Grace. And we're always trying to read our characters on screen and what's really going on underneath. And what's so important is a scene with Badger here with Grace when they meet up, because he's saying like, yeah, I know your husband is a jerk, but he's no killer. And they go into this talk how because he's a doctor, he believes he can really do anything because he's doing this good by helping kids with cancer, and it kind of boosts his ego. And this is what his coworker who used to work with Stuart says to Grace in the episode, how he doesn't even know if he was doing this for the kids, if he was just doing this for being in the spotlight and being praised by these parents for saving their child, and this was all for his ego. So you learn more and more of just these bad qualities of Jonathan and how unloyal he was to his family, how selfish he is, and he even admits how much of an ego he has. But there's still nothing there showing you him as a killer, and I think obviously he's the red herring of this series, as I've said. And if you're casting Hugh Grant as the role of Jonathan, he is such a likable face, and the way he presents himself, pleading that he's innocent, it's definitely a reason it's Hugh Grant. I mean, if he was the murderer, I wouldn't even buy it at this point that it's Hugh Grant being the murderer. It just wouldn't make sense. It's not his character. Now, if you've watched my previous 2 reviews, I'm gung-ho on Grace being the one who is the murderer here. Before we even run into how much my theory's been supported in this episode, what I think is really interesting about what happens with Grace's character here is we saw at the end of last episode, like I said, she was on a war path against her husband. But by the end of this episode, she's actually in defense of her husband. And she's starting this forgiving and justification of his affair in her head. And it's not what you're thinking, where they're making it on the layer, on the surface as a viewer, that she's trying to justify him not being the murderer. She knows he's not the murderer because she's the murderer. She's justifying and trying to think this whole episode how he's not this total monster in the way he hurt her family, and her being appalled by him having a kid that's not hers. But you see this in her conversations with her going to see Dr. Stewart. You see this in her conversations with her father this episode, and him constantly saying like, are you even thinking about getting back together with him? And it comes full circle by her saying, we need to get Haley Fitzgerald, the lawyer. And the dad's like, for you? And she's like, no, for Jonathan, which is interesting because one of the worst moves Grace's character's made is that she hasn't lawyered up yet, even though Sylvia's told her to, her father's told her multiple times, and now she's actually looking out for Jonathan over her with the lawyer situation here. And I love even Grace's father saying to her how much only a monster could do what happened to Elena. And he's saying it to, I believe the monster is, in Grace. But you see what's so interesting about Grace being a therapist and her character adding to her justifications for what Jonathan did with the affair. She's talking about now all these diagnoses like hero worship and following for the savior, and really actually leaning into what Jonathan was saying to her and her son about how she was obsessed with him, which the way Dr. Stewart says it is not true, he's saying, and that he's exaggerating that, but she doesn't want to believe that, and she's going back into denial about this, Grace. And you see Jonathan's playing that manipulation because, yeah, he's saying he's sorry and he messed up, but he's still not fully coming open about what he messed up on and still putting blame on Elena. And you see also in Grace's motivation is that she knows what's toying at her is it's easier for her to look at Jonathan as not as bad because she envisions in her head how good he was to these kids in the hospital, and she wants Henry to have some kind of image of his father that's not terrible. But what's really important is the dialogue here with Haley Fitzgerald talking to Grace, and she's like, my clients think I can undo everything, wipe the slate clean, but I don't save marriages. That's what you do. I just muck up state cases, and that's what you would be hiring me to do. So this kind of reveals why this show's called The Undoing, and I think what it's setting up is Jonathan and Grace, where we thought maybe they go toe-to-toe, they're actually going to team up here against the state and these detectives using Haley Fitzgerald to cover up the two prime suspects in Grace and Jonathan and themselves. And that where Badger fits into this is that he's this public defender, but he deep down sees something suspicious with Grace. And he sees that Jonathan's probably innocent, but Grace is smart because she's going for the aggressive lawyer that will just win at all costs in Haley Fitzgerald. So where there's some really good juxtaposition going on is that the scene when the detective actually goes to Grace's father and says, I think your daughter's withholding information. He's like, get out of here. You can talk to me when you have a warrant. Grace, then the next scene becomes a detective with Fernando, Elena's husband, aka Benicio del Toro Jr. She's now interrogating him and saying he's withholding information about him and his wife, Elena. She's saying this to a man who lost his wife, and this is the most unlikable moment we've seen of Grace yet, especially when she justifies Jonathan's behavior because Fernando's like, oh, what kind of doctor screws the sick kid's parent? And she just turns it back on him saying, what kind of mother screws the doctor? And she has a flash thinking about how Fernando could have a motive here and thinking of him being angry about the affair and being the one who would kill the wife. And that's why she goes to the detectives now, because she's getting cocky. She's like, you know what? I'll get them off of my husband and off of my scent by pinning it now on Fernando. Like, why haven't you guys talked to him? But she should have went with a lawyer, and she paints herself into a corner because she comes in aggressive to these detectives like, he had motive. He's clearly angry. And I know this from my 20 years of psychological training. But the detective's calling her out because it's not solid evidence. It's just by hunch. And he's like, are you a mind reader? But finally we get justification of why these detectives have been so harsh to her and over-aggressive, where you might have thought that maybe wasn't totally believable and why are they such jerks? But now it all makes sense. And her bringing up, was there any camera footage? There's camera footage on all streets in New York. She's screwing herself here. And I love because when they're bringing out the laptop to show her the footage, we finally, again, we hadn't seen it all episode, but these extreme close-ups we're talking about of her on her eyes, it's showing that like psycho side of her. That is the side that I believe was in the moment of killing Elena and that she's hiding from everybody. But when it feels threatened, they zoom in on it. And that's why when they're bringing the footage, she's panicking and they show her on the camera. So officially, her and her husband are the only ones in the vicinity of the crime scene that night. And it looks really bad for her. And this explains why they look at her like a suspect. And please, if you are on this team convinced it's Jonathan, I'll tell you why you're wrong. You're wrong because, again, it goes back to one simple thing, and that's in the intro of the show, showing little Grace next to blood dropping down. They're giving you right there in the opening credits that she's a murderer. She has to be. Or I'm going to look like a big idiot, but that's okay. But again, I watch week to week. I don't cheat this. I'm watching with you guys and making my theories. I didn't read the book either, so this is all on hunch and all the hints they've given us, and I'm still just sold now it's Grace. But what does worry me in my theory is that if they're kind of showing us her on the footage now, maybe they're both red herrings. Who knows, but I think just thematically to the show, it's going to be her, and they're going to angle this more now of maybe not so much a mystery of who did it, but how these two together are going to get out of this and undo what's happened to their family through this lawyer. Now, this episode for me, I'm going to give a 9.1. I do actually think it was the weakest of the three because there was some moments where the pace got a little slow here, and I do feel like it could have been trimmed up a little bit, but I'm still finding it super riveting. I'm constantly being pulled in by conflict, constantly having with characters, and learning more about our two main players each episode with Jonathan and Grace, and trying to figure out what really happened. I don't understand people were saying this is slow and not interesting. I completely disagree. I'm fully enjoying this series, and I think it does enough visually as well to really give you a lot of eye candy and hints thematically, visually, and the acting, of course, has been top notch. So I don't really see what people are complaining about. Let me know what you thought of this episode down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I read every comment and try to respond as many as I can. Also, my fan question of the week, the theory you guys may have, because this was important, but I don't know why they showed it, but they quickly showed Grace's father in this episode go to Fernando's with the baby there, looking at them in the middle of the night on the street. Did he go talk to Fernando before Fernando went to Grace? I wonder what actually happened there or why he's even watching him. Give me your theories down below on that. It has to be important. They won't just throw that in there for no reason. And please make sure to subscribe so you don't miss one of my reviews of The Undoing. I'll be doing every episode. I also do celebrity interviews and movie reviews, so you don't want to miss that. And if you like what I do, I'd love to be able to do more videos and do this full time. All I ask to make that happen and help make that happen is a kind $2 monthly donation, which you'll see a link down below. It's a PayPal link that if you want to support the channel and support my dream and goal of doing this and really want to see more videos, that would be a great help. And as always, follow me at Steve Varley Show on Twitter and Instagram for more of me. And I'll see you next time.